The door was heavier than it needed to be. That was the first thing D'Artagnan had thought when he moved into his lodgings on the Rue des Fossoyeurs. And it was the thing he thought again now as he leaned his shoulder into it and felt the wood give way with a low, familiar groan. It was the kind of groan that a door makes when it has been opened 10,000 times, when its hinges have grown slow and easy with age, when it has long since given up the pretense of resistance. He stepped out into the evening. Paris breathed around him. That was the only way to describe it, really. The city breathed. After a long, warm day, the streets exhaled slowly, the way a sleeping person exhales, without effort, without thought. The cobblestones beneath his boots still held the warmth of the afternoon sun deep inside them, and D'Artagnan stood still for a moment in the doorway, feeling that warmth rise faintly through the soles of his shoes. Above the narrow canyon of rooftops, the sky had turned the color of old amber, a deep, settled gold, fading at its edges into something softer. Lavender, perhaps, or the gray-blue of a pigeon's wing. He had no errands. This was a rare and pleasant thing. He stood with it for a moment, the way you stand at the edge of a warm room before you decide to go in. No messages to carry, no captain to report to, no particular place to be before any particular hour. Just the evening, and the street, and the slow amber sky above the chimneys of Paris. He began to walk. The Rue des Fossoyeurs was quiet at this hour, which was part of why D'Artagnan had come to love it. In the mornings it bustled, a vegetable seller with her cart, the clatter of a blacksmith 2 doors down, the shouts of boys running errands for the tradesmen along the lane. But in the evenings, it settled. The vegetable cart was long gone, leaving behind only a faint green sweetness in the air, the smell of crushed leaves and cool earth. The blacksmith's hammer had fallen silent. Even the boys had disappeared, called home to supper by voices from upper windows. D'Artagnan walked slowly, which was not his natural inclination. He was by nature a young man of quick movements, quick to walk, quick to speak, quick to reach for the sword at his hip when occasion demanded. But tonight, there was nothing that demanded anything of him, and so he found himself moving at a different pace entirely, a drifting pace, the pace of a man who is watching the world rather than moving through it. He noticed things he usually walked past. The yellow cat who lived behind the baker's shop, curled now into a tight circle on a warm stone step, one ear twitching slowly as D'Artagnan's footsteps approached, then settling again as he passed. The row of clay pots outside the herbalist's window, rosemary, thyme, something purple-flowered that he did not know the name of, each one still faintly silver with afternoon water, catching the amber light in little gleaming drops. The great wooden beam above the doorway of the old tanner's shop, worn smooth and dark with years, its grains soft as river-worn wood. He reached the end of the lane and paused. Somewhere nearby, a church bell was counting the hour. He listened without counting. The sound was unhurried, each note round and full and deliberate, rolling out through the cooling air, and then fading slowly, 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 the way a stone sinks through still water. When the bell had finished, the silence that followed felt fuller than the silence before it, as though the sound had stretched the air and left more room for quiet. Paris was so often loud. It was one of the things that still surprised him, even now. The sheer accumulated noise of the city, the way it pressed against you from all sides. Hawkers and horses and the grinding wheels of carts over stone. But in these hours between the end of the working day and the deeper hours of night, the city found a temporary truce with silence. Not a complete silence, never that, but a gentler kind of noise, a murmur rather than a roar. He turned towards the river. The streets through which he walked were washed in amber and shadow. Where the lane was narrow, the shadows pooled early and deep, and D'Artagnan moved through alternating bars of warmth and cool, light and dark, the way you might pass through a forest where the canopy opens and closes above you. In the patches of evening light, the old stone walls glowed the color of warm bread. In the shadows between, they turned to the gray of river silt. Here, a window was still open to the air, and through it drifted the smell of something being cooked, a rich, slow smell, the smell of a pot that has been on the fire for a long time and has had hours to become something wonderful. Onions and herbs, perhaps, and something deeper underneath. D'Artagnan breathed it in without stopping, carrying it with him as he walked. Here, a doorway where an old man sat on a low stool, his chin resting on his chest, his hands folded in his lap, asleep, or nearly so. A small dog lay at his feet, equally still, its sides rising and falling with the easy rhythm of deep rest. D'Artagnan passed them both without a sound. Here, two children in an upper window, watching the street below with the serious, dreamy attention of children who have been told it is nearly time for bed and are making the most of these last unhurried minutes. One of them saw D'Artagnan and watched him pass with wide, curious eyes. He nodded to her. She turned back to the street. He walked. The cobblestones passed beneath his feet one by one, smooth and rounded where the center of the lane had been worn by 1,000 years of footsteps, rougher at the edges where the cartwheels had left their marks. He had walked cobblestones like these all his life, first in the small streets of Gascony, then on the long road north towards Paris, and now here, every day, in this city that was still sometimes strange to him, and sometimes felt, in moments like this one, like the only place in the world that existed. The air was cooling now. He could feel it against his face and against the backs of his hands, a softness that had not been there an hour ago. Summer was not yet gone. It would not leave without argument, but in the evenings it let autumn speak first, and autumn always spoke softly. The Seine appeared between two buildings, a flat silver gleam between the stone. D'Artagnan did not stop, not yet. He allowed himself to walk towards it gradually, the river getting wider and more present with each step, until he came to the low wall of the embankment and could look down and watch the water move. The Seine in the evening was a different river than the Seine at midday. At midday it was busy and blue, full of the reflections of clouds and the wakes of small boats. But now, in the amber and fading light, it moved more slowly, and it held the colors of the sky, the warm gold at the horizon, the softer gray-blue overhead, all stirred together gently, the way colors are stirred in a shallow bowl. There was no hurry to the water. There never was, of course, but tonight it seemed particularly unhurried, sliding beneath the old stone bridges with the easy, patient rhythm of something that has been moving in the same direction for 10,000 years and has learned to do it without effort. D'Artagnan rested his forearms on the wall. He watched the water. A leaf came past, a broad, flat leaf, still green, barely beginning to curl at its edges. It moved without urgency, spinning very slowly as it went, carried by the current towards some destination it had no interest in choosing. He watched it until it passed under the shadow of a bridge and disappeared. Somewhere further along the embankment, a man was fishing. He sat on a low folding stool with his line in the water and his hat pulled low against the evening light. He did not appear to have caught anything. He did not appear to mind. Pigeons settled on the parapet of the bridge. They shuffled and arranged themselves in that busy, purposeless way that pigeons have, and then they grew still. The river moved. The evening deepened. D'Artagnan stood at the wall for a long while, longer than he had intended. He was not thinking about anything in particular. That was the luxury of an evening with no errands. The mind could wander the way water wanders, following the shape of the ground beneath it without urgency, finding its level. He thought, vaguely, about the journey that had brought him here to Paris, about the long road north, the yellow fields of Gascony giving way to greener country, the villages that had appeared and disappeared behind him one by one. About the morning he had arrived in this city and had stood at the edge of it, looking at the rooftops stretching away in all directions, feeling both very small and very full of hope. He was still full of hope, he thought. It was a quiet kind of hope, an unhurried kind. The kind you did not need to do anything with tonight. After a while, he pushed himself gently away from the wall and turned back towards the streets. The sky overhead had shifted entirely now, from gold into something softer, a deep blue-gray, the color the sky always becomes in that unhurried interval between the last light and the first dark, when you cannot quite call it day anymore and cannot quite call it night. A few stars had appeared, pale and tentative, testing the dark. The first lanterns were being lit in the windows of the houses along the embankment. D'Artagnan watched them come on one by one, each one a small, warm declaration against the gathering dark. He was hungry. He noticed this without urgency, the way you notice the first cool breath of autumn. A gentle signal from the body, nothing more. Down the street, perhaps 10 minutes' walk, there was a tavern where Athos went most evenings, and where Porthos ate quantities that alarmed the serving staff and delighted him, and where Aramis sometimes consented to appear, provided the wine was acceptable and the company did not descend too far into nonsense. D'Artagnan had not planned to go there tonight, but now, standing in the blue-gray evening, with the stars coming out overhead and the smell of woodsmoke beginning to drift down from the chimneys of Paris, he found that he was walking in that direction. The cobblestones were darker now, and the air was full of the sound of the city settling. A cart somewhere, wheels grinding to a slow halt, a shutter closing, a dog answering another dog and then falling silent. And underneath it all, barely a sound at all, more of a feeling, the deep, warm pulse of a city full of people, full of candles, full of fires burning low in hearths behind thick stone walls. Paris at evening. D'Artagnan walked through it slowly and felt entirely at home. He heard it before he saw it, a low murmur of voices, the kind that comes not from any single conversation, but from many conversations happening all at once in a small space. A warm, indistinct sound, like the sound of a river heard from a little distance away, or rain falling steadily on a roof. Then the smell arrived, woodsmoke and tallow candles, and something roasting somewhere deep in the building. And underneath all of it, the rich, yeasty warmth of wine and bread and people who had been comfortably together for some time. D'Artagnan slowed his walk instinctively as he approached, the way you slow when you are coming towards something you want to arrive at gradually, something you do not want to rush. The door of the tavern was low and thick, studded with old iron nails worn smooth, its wood dark with decades of hands reaching for the same spot. He pressed his palm against it. The wood was warm. He pushed it open. The room leaned in around him. That was the feeling. Not that he entered the room so much as that the room came to meet him, wrapping itself around his shoulders with its warmth and its low light and its familiar, unhurried noise. He stood still for a moment in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust from the blue-gray of the street to the amber of the candles. The tavern was not large. That was what he had always liked about it. There were perhaps a dozen tables, most of them occupied by figures leaning comfortably together over their cups. And the ceiling was low enough that the candle smoke gathered there in a soft haze before finding its way out through the cracks in the timbers. The beams themselves were old. Very old, D'Artagnan had always thought. Darkened to the color of burnt honey, crossed by other beams, and from one of them hung a bunch of dried herbs that had been hanging there long enough to have turned from green to the pale, dusty silver of old lavender. The fire burned at the far end of the room. He found them at their usual table. Athos sat with his back to the wall, as he always did, his long legs stretched out beneath the table, his arms folded loosely across his chest. His face in the firelight was calm, profoundly, unhurriedly calm, the way a lake is calm when the wind has been still for a long time. He had a cup in front of him, and his eyes were half closed in the particular way that meant he was not asleep, but was simply resting behind them, letting the evening pass at its own pace. Porthos sat opposite, and Porthos, naturally, was eating. He was eating with the focused, satisfied attention of a man who considers eating to be one of the great serious pursuits of his life, which was, in Porthos's view, entirely correct. Before him sat a platter from which most of the contents had already disappeared, and a great round loaf of bread that he was tearing into pieces with his hands and using to chase the remaining sauce around the edges of the plate. His large, cheerful face was flushed from the fire and the wine, and he looked, as he almost always looked, like a man who has decided that the world is an excellent place and sees no reason to revise this opinion. Aramis was at the corner of the table, turned slightly sideways, reading. He held the small leather-bound book close to a candle, his brow slightly furrowed in the way it always furrowed when he was reading something that was either very interesting or very problematic, and it was never entirely easy to tell which. He was dressed, as usual, with a care that made his companions look as though they had gotten themselves together in the dark. His long fingers turned a page. They looked up as D'Artagnan pulled a chair from a neighboring table and settled himself among them. "You are late," said Porthos. "I was walking," D'Artagnan said. Porthos repeated, with the mild bewilderment of a man who finds the concept of purposeless walking slightly beyond him. Then he shrugged and reached for more bread. Athos said nothing. He unfolded his arms and poured D'Artagnan a cup of wine from the jug at the center of the table. A quiet gesture, unhurried, the simple hospitality of a man who does not need to make a ceremony of it. D'Artagnan wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move into his palms. Aramis turned another page. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. A single loud pop, then the slow settling of the wood back into its steady burning. The kind of burning that has given up any particular ambition and simply burns because that is what fire does. The light it cast was generous and uneven, reaching some corners of the room and leaving others in comfortable shadow, flickering gently on the worn stone of the wall behind it, so that the shadows of the flames moved there like slow, dancing things. D'Artagnan drank. The wine was burgundy. It was always burgundy here. The tavern keeper had firm opinions about wine, and none of them were complicated. And it was good, the way simple things are good when you have been outside in the cooling air and have come in from it, and the warmth of the room is still settling into your bones. He tasted it without hurrying. It tasted of warmth itself, somehow, of dark earth and something faintly sweet, and the long, slow months it had spent becoming what it was. From the kitchen, somewhere behind the wall, came a sound of something being stirred in an iron pot. A long, slow, rhythmic sound. The sound went on for a while, and then stopped, and then started again. It was the sound of someone who has been cooking for a long time and has found the particular peace that comes from repeated, purposeful work. Porthos finished his bread and leaned back in his chair with a sigh that contained the full measure of his satisfaction. "The chicken," he said to no one in particular, as if rendering a verdict, "was exceptional." Athos opened his eyes slightly. "You have been saying that about the chicken here for 3 years," Aramis said, without looking up from his book. "And I have been right every time," said Porthos. No one disputed this. Athos closed his eyes again. D'Artagnan smiled at his cup. A little while passed in which nobody said anything, and it was the particular kind of nothing that only happens among people who have been in enough difficulty together that silence between them requires no explaining. D'Artagnan had learned this slowly, over many months, that there was a version of quiet that was empty and uncomfortable, the quiet of strangers in a room waiting for someone to speak. And then there was this other version, the quiet of people who are content simply to be in the same place at the same time. This was the second kind. It settled around the table like the candlelight settled, without effort, without announcement. The tavern murmured around them. At the far table, 2 men in dark coats were speaking to each other in low, unhurried voices, their heads bent together over something, though whether it was business or friendship or something in between, D'Artagnan could not tell. Near the door, an old woman sat alone with a cup of something hot that steamed gently, her hands wrapped around it the same way D'Artagnan's hands were wrapped around his wine. And she gazed at nothing in particular with the contented expression of someone who is exactly where she wishes to be. A young serving boy moved between the tables with the practiced ease of someone who has been navigating this particular small room for a long time, knowing instinctively where to step and where to turn, the platters balanced on his arm with careless expertise. The candles burned, the fire burned, the wine was poured again. D'Artagnan watched the fire. There was always something to watch in a fire, if you were willing to look. Tonight it burned in layers. At the very heart of it, where the logs had collapsed into each other, a deep, almost white heat pulsed steadily. And above it, the flames moved in the amber and gold that everyone means when they say the color of fire. And at the edges, they went to blue, briefly, at the very tips, a color so clean and unexpected that it was always faintly surprising, no matter how many times you noticed it. The flames moved continuously, but not urgently. They rose and settled and rose again. They reached and pulled back. They breathed. He noticed that Athos, with his eyes still half closed, was watching the fire as well. They watched it together, without saying so. Athos, sated and comfortable, had begun to doze. This happened sometimes after a large meal, And it happened now with a particular dignity that Porthos brought to everything. He did not slump or sprawl, but simply grew very still, his large frame at rest in the chair, his breathing slow and even, one hand resting on the table beside his empty cup. If he was aware that he was falling asleep, he showed no sign of it. He had simply decided, in the Porthos fashion, that sleep was the next good thing, and had proceeded directly to it. Aramis turned a page. He read with his lips very slightly parted, as though the words were finding their way through him, not only by sight, but by some smaller, quieter sound that was nearly soundless, and his eyes moved across the page in the slow, steady way of someone who is reading not to arrive somewhere, but to be somewhere. The candlelight on the open page was very soft. "What are you reading?" D'Artagnan asked him quietly, so as not to disturb the stillness of the room. Aramis considered the question for a moment. "Tales," he said at last. "Old ones, from the countryside." He paused. "Very quiet tales." D'Artagnan nodded. He reached for the wine jug. Outside, somewhere beyond the thick walls of the tavern, the sound of the city continued its slow, distant murmur. A cart somewhere, the last of the day's business being concluded, then silence again. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, quietly, as though it had decided not to make an event of it. D'Artagnan heard it first as a new note in the silence, a soft and steady sound against the shuttered window above them, like someone tapping very gently, very patiently, with no particular message to deliver. Rain on the shutters of a warm room. He sat with it. Athos reached out and refilled his own cup, and then, without looking, refilled D'Artagnan's as well. The fire breathed, the rain tapped. The candles burned low and steady, each flame a small, patient thing, lighting the little circle of the table and letting the rest of the room do as it liked. The night outside was doing what nights do, deepening steadily into itself, growing quieter by degrees, moving without hurry towards the very still hours on the other side of midnight. Inside there was wine and warmth, and the sound of an old book being turned to a new page. Aramis cleared his throat very gently, the way a person does when they are about to speak in a quiet room and do not want to disturb it more than necessary. "Shall I read aloud?" he said. He was not asking anyone in particular, but no one said no. Porthos went on sleeping with great serenity. Athos settled a little further back in his chair and regarded the fire. D'Artagnan leaned his elbows on the table and rested his chin in his hands, and looked at the single candle nearest him, its flame so steady it might have been painted there. Aramis began to read. His voice was low and unhurried, shaped by years of reading aloud to himself, a voice that neither rose nor fell dramatically, but simply carried the words forward, one after another, like a slow river carrying leaves, gently, with no particular sense of urgency or destination. The words settled into the room the way the rain settled on the street outside. They went on, and the fire went on burning, and the candles went on burning, and the rain went on tapping, and the night went quietly on. D'Artagnan listened, and slowly, softly, without entirely meaning to, he let his eyes grow heavy. The first story Aramis read was about a miller. Not a remarkable miller, not a miller with extraordinary adventures awaiting him, or enemies to outwit, or fortunes to seek. Simply a miller, who lived in a small village in the valley of the Loire, in a house beside his mill, and who woke every morning before the sun and walked to the mill pond to watch the mist rise off the water. That was how the story began. The mist rose off the water, and the miller watched it, and the village was still asleep behind him. Aramis read slowly. D'Artagnan listened without thinking about whether he was listening. The words arrived and settled somewhere inside him the way warmth settles, not in any particular place, but everywhere at once, gradually, without announcement. He was aware of the candle in front of him, its flame so composed and still in the breathless air of the tavern that it barely seemed to move at all. He was aware of his own hands resting on the table, loose and open. He was aware, distantly, of Porthos's slow and even breathing somewhere across the table, and of the rain continuing its patient conversation with the shuttered window. The miller, in the story, had a boat, a small boat tied to a post at the edge of the mill pond, and every evening when his work was done, the miller untied it and rowed out to the middle of the water and sat there. He did not fish. He did not read. He simply sat in the middle of the pond as the light changed, watching the sky reflect itself in the dark water around him. And the pond was so still on those evenings that he sometimes could not tell, looking over the side of the boat, whether he was floating above the sky or suspended inside it. Aramis paused. He turned a page. The pause lasted only a moment, just long enough for the rain and the fire to be heard again, just long enough for the room to breathe. And then his voice resumed, low and unhurried, picking up the thread of the miller and his pond and his quiet evenings on the water. The fire had burned lower since they had arrived. D'Artagnan noticed this without attaching any importance to it. The logs had settled into each other over the course of the evening, losing their individual shapes, becoming instead a single glowing mass of deep red and orange, pulsing slowly with a heat that was, if anything, more intense for being quieter. The tall, active flames of earlier in the evening had given way to something steadier, a low, constant brightness that did not leap or crackle, but simply radiated, the way a warm stone radiates heat long after the sun has left it. Athos had shifted slightly in his chair. His arms were no longer folded, but rested now at his sides, his head inclined very slightly towards Aramis's voice, his eyes on the middle distance, not on anything in particular, but on the comfortable nowhere that eyes go when the body is at rest and the mind has found something to follow. His cup was in his hand, barely, the way a cup rests in a hand that has forgotten it is holding anything. The story moved on. The miller's daughter came home from the city. This was not a dramatic arrival. She came home on the back of a farmer's cart, wrapped in a wool cloak, and the farmer let her down at the edge of the village in the late afternoon, and she walked the rest of the way through fields that smelled of cut hay and cooling earth. She had been away for 2 years. The road home was the same road she had always known, and yet it seemed narrower than she remembered it, and the trees along it seemed taller, and the ruts in the mud seemed deeper. She noticed all of this without judgment. Things had simply grown and changed their proportions, in the way that things do when you have been away from them long enough to see them new. Her father was at the mill pond. Of course he was. She found him there, sitting in his small boat in the middle of the water, watching the last of the evening light move across the surface. She stood at the edge of the pond and waited. He saw her and lifted one hand in greeting, the way you greet someone you have been expecting. Then he took up his oars and rowed slowly back to shore, the oars making small, soft sounds in the water, the sound of something measured and careful, of something that knows it does not need to hurry. Aramis's voice was very quiet now. He had been reading for some time, and his voice had found its level, the place where it would stay for the rest of the evening, not performing, not projecting, simply present, the way the fire was present, the way the rain was present. D'Artagnan's chin had sunk further into his hands. He was aware of this distantly, the way you are aware of your own breathing, not because you are thinking about it, but because it is simply there, a background fact, a steady and reliable thing. Between the end of the first story and the beginning of the second, there was a small, comfortable silence. Aramis took a slow sip from his cup. He turned several pages at once, not skipping anything, D'Artagnan sensed, but passing over something that was not what this evening required, moving toward something that was. The pages made a soft sound as they turned, a dry and papery whisper that was somehow entirely at home among the other sounds of the room. The serving boy came and went. He moved with great quietness, as though he understood that the table had arrived somewhere that it would be wrong to disturb. And he refilled the wine jug and was gone before D'Artagnan had fully registered his presence. Porthos breathed, slowly, in and out, in and out. His large, comfortable chest rose and fell with the dependable rhythm of a man who is entirely at peace with the world and sees no reason, even in sleep, to be otherwise. The rain on the shutters continued. It had found its pace sometime in the last hour, and had held it ever since. Not heavy rain, not the kind that hammers and rushes and makes you worry about leaks, but the gentle, steady kind that simply falls because falling is what it does, and will go on falling for a long while yet, quietly, without drama, making the warmth inside feel more complete by contrast. The second story was about a shepherd. He lived on the hills above a small town in the south of France, where the lavender grew in long gray-purple rows on the slopes, and the air in summer was so full of it that you could taste it if you opened your mouth. The shepherd walked his hills every day from before dawn to after dusk, following his flock along paths he had made himself over many years, paths that wound between the lavender and the wild rosemary, and the small, silver-leafed plants that had no names he knew. He walked slowly because his flock walked slowly. He had learned, over many years, to match his pace to theirs. D'Artagnan found himself thinking about walking slowly, about this evening, and the cobblestones still warm from the day's sun, and the yellow cat on the step, and the river moving under the amber sky. He had not been trying to remember any of it. It had simply drifted back to him while Aramis read, the way things drift back when the mind is quiet enough to let them. Unhurried, in no particular order, arriving softly, and then resting there like the light from a candle rests on the wood of a table. He let it rest. The shepherd in the story had a dog. It was a large gray dog with a heavy coat and slow amber eyes. The kind of dog that has been living alongside a person for long enough that it no longer needs to think about what the person wants. It simply went where the shepherd went, stayed when the shepherd stopped, and on the evenings when they came home from the hills, and the shepherd lit his small fire outside his stone cottage, and sat in the last of the warmth, the dog lay down beside him and put its great gray head on its paws, and watched the fire with the same calm, untroubled attention that the shepherd did. They watched it together without saying so. D'Artagnan smiled slightly at his candle. Aramis read on. Time passed in the way that time passes when something good is happening. Not quickly and not slowly, but in the right way. In the way that makes you aware, somewhere underneath the evening, that these are the hours that settle into you and stay. The fire breathed. The rain tapped. The candle in front of D'Artagnan had burned considerably lower than it had been when Aramis started reading. He could see this from the short, soft column of wax remaining, the flame now closer to the table than it had been, smaller but no less steady, sitting at the very top of what was left, and burning with a patience that seemed somehow admirable. He watched it for a long time. A candle flame, if you watch it long enough, begins to seem less like a thing that is burning and more like a thing that is breathing. It moves in and out of itself, expanding very slightly on an inhale and contracting on an exhale, though there is no breath in the room to cause it. Perhaps it breathes the air of the room. Perhaps it makes its own small weather. D'Artagnan did not know. He watched it and let the thought go, and watched it some more. Athos had set his cup down at some point. D'Artagnan did not remember when. It sat on the table now, empty, and Athos's hand rested beside it, open, relaxed. The fingers slightly curved in the way that hands curve when all the intention has gone out of them, and they are simply resting. The second story ended the way the first one had. Not with a conclusion exactly, but with a settling. The shepherd came home from the hills. He lit his fire. He sat in its warmth with his gray dog beside him and watched the lavender hills go dark in the evening, row by row, color by color, from the pale blue-purple of dusk to the deep gray of full dark. And then he went inside, and the fire burned down, and the stars came out above the hills. And that was all. Aramis lowered the book very slightly, not closing it, just resting it in his lap, as though it needed a moment to breathe between stories, the same as a person does. The room was very quiet now. It was a deeper quiet than it had been earlier in the evening. The tavern had emptied gradually while Aramis read, other guests departing one or two at a time, and D'Artagnan had been aware of this only as a series of small sounds. A chair pushed back, the low murmur of a good night, the brief rectangle of night air as the door opened and closed. Now there were only a few other figures remaining, and they were quiet. And the serving boy sat on a stool near the kitchen door, with his chin in his hand, watching nothing in particular, his eyes soft and heavy. The rain went on. The fire went on. And the candle in front of D'Artagnan went on burning, smaller now, its flame a little softer, a little lower, casting its small, warm circle of light over the table and the cups, and the hands of the four friends resting there. Porthos, asleep and entirely content. Aramis, with his book in his lap and his eyes half closed. Athos watching the fire with the quiet attention he gave to everything. And D'Artagnan, with his chin in his hands and his eyes on the last of the candle, feeling the warmth of the room all around him, like a thing you could reach out and touch. He did not feel sleepy, exactly. He felt something else. Something quieter than sleepy. Something more like the state the river had been in this evening, moving slowly in the right direction without any particular effort, simply following the shape of the ground beneath it. He felt the way the shepherd's dog looked when it lay down beside the fire. He felt the way the mill pond looked at dusk. He felt, in short, entirely at rest. Aramis turned a page. "One more," he said softly, and nobody said otherwise. The goodbyes were slow and gentle, the way all good evenings end. Porthos surfaced from his sleep the way a large, amiable fish surfaces from deep water. Gradually, without alarm, blinking his way back into the room with the serene expression of a man who had been somewhere very comfortable and had no complaints about returning. He looked around the table, registered that the candles were low, and the fire was nearly out, and the wine jug was empty, and nodded slowly, as though this confirmed everything he needed to know about the evening. "Good," he said, with great finality, and began to look for his cloak. Athos rose without speaking. This was not unusual. He settled his cloak across his shoulders with the quiet economy of a man who has always dressed and undressed without making any occasion of it, dropped a small number of coins on the table with a soft, unhurried sound, and paused to rest one hand briefly on D'Artagnan's shoulder as he passed. A touch that said nothing and everything. The kind that only lasts a moment, but lands somewhere lasting. Then he was through the door and gone into the dark. Aramis closed his book. He closed it the way you close something you intend to return to, marking his place with a folded piece of paper taken from his coat pocket, smoothing the cover once with the flat of his hand, as though setting it to rest. He exchanged with D'Artagnan a small, companionable nod. The nod of two people who have spent a quiet evening together, and are agreed that it was exactly the right kind of evening. And then he was gone too, his footsteps barely audible on the stone floor, the door swinging shut behind him with its familiar, heavy sound. Porthos, cloak finally located and arranged to his satisfaction, paused in the doorway and filled it entirely. "The chicken," he said again, and then he was gone. D'Artagnan sat alone at the table for a moment. The last candle was very nearly finished. Its flame sat at the very tip of what remained, barely the height of a fingernail, burning with a steadiness that seemed almost willful at this point, as though it had decided it would last precisely as long as it needed to, and not a moment less. He watched it until the serving boy came and began quietly collecting the cups, and then he rose, put on his own cloak, and went to the door. Outside, the rain had softened to almost nothing. He stood in the doorway a moment before stepping into it, listening. It was barely rain any longer, more of a presence than a precipitation. A fine mist that was neither quite falling nor quite hanging, but simply existing in the air, cool against his face, settling onto his cloak without weight. The cobblestones below the step were dark and wet, and gleaming faintly in the light of the nearest lantern, each stone holding a small, blurred reflection of the flame. 100 small flames in the street, none of them moving. He stepped out. The door closed behind him, and with it went the last of the warmth and the candle smell and the murmur of the tavern. And for a moment, there was only the night, and the mist, and the quiet. He stood still in it. Paris at this hour was not the same city as Paris in the daytime. The daytime city was many things at once. It was loud and competing, and alive with the effort of people trying to accomplish things. But the city at this hour, late and quiet and mist-washed, had simplified itself down to its essentials: stone, light, shadow. The sound of his own footsteps, which had not yet begun. He began to walk. The streets were nearly empty. Here and there, a figure moved at a distance, rapt and purposeful. heading home from somewhere or to somewhere, shoes quick on the wet stone. But these figures came and went and left no impression, absorbed back into the dark almost as soon as they appeared. And D'Artagnan did not watch them go. He walked at his own pace, which was still the slow, drifting pace of the evening, the pace that had carried him to the river and along the embankment and eventually to the tavern door. It was not a young man's pace. It was the pace of someone considerably older or considerably more at ease than he usually was. He noticed the light first. The lanterns along this part of the street had been recently tended. Their flames were full and bright, each one casting a warm circle on the wet cobblestones below it. And between the circles there were intervals of soft shadow that were not truly dark, but only a deeper version of the mist. D'Artagnan walked through light and shadow and light and shadow, his cloak darkening at the shoulders where the mist collected, his breath just barely visible in the cool air. The stones underfoot were slick and smooth, the water on them making each cobble catch the lantern light and hold it for a moment so brief it was really only an impression, a shine, gone by the time the next footstep landed. He found himself watching them as he walked, these small, repeated gleamings, each one slightly different in angle and brightness from the last. A whole quiet language of light beneath his feet that no one had written and no one would read. The mist drifted. He passed a garden wall, very old, its stones dark with moisture. A vine trained along the top of it in patient horizontal lines, its leaves small and still in the still air. Beyond the wall, barely visible in the dark, the shapes of trees, not moving, simply standing, their branches held in the particular stillness that trees hold at night when the wind has gone. A stillness so complete it seems like a kind of attention, as though the trees are listening for something. He passed a fountain where water trickled from a stone lion's mouth into a basin below. The sound of it was very clear in the quiet, a small, steady sound, exactly the same second by second, the kind of sound that is not silence, but produces the same feeling as silence. A background presence so consistent that the ear stops registering it as sound and simply incorporates it into the quiet. He slowed as he passed it, listening, and then walked on, carrying the sound with him for a little way before it faded behind him. He came to the bridge. He had not planned to cross here, but his feet had brought him back to the same bridge where he had stood earlier, and he slowed again at the low stone parapet and looked down. The Seine was darker than before. What had been amber and soft in the evening light was now a deep, moving darkness, the color of charcoal, the color of the sky itself. And the reflections in it were not colors anymore, but only lights. The lanterns on the embankment, each one broken into long, shimmering lines by the movement of the current, stretching and condensing and stretching again as the water slid beneath them. And among these reflections, far above them, the stars. Not many stars. The mist had dimmed most of them, but a few, very faint, very still, hanging in the dark water as though they had been there always. D'Artagnan looked up to find them overhead. There they were, the same stars, at a great and comfortable distance, doing what stars do in the small hours, simply being present, simply burning their patient and unhurried light across the dark, as they had been doing since long before Paris was Paris, or France was France, or any of the people walking its streets tonight had existed to look up and notice them. He rested his forearms on the parapet, the stone cool and slightly damp through the wool of his sleeves. The river moved below him. It moved the way it always moved, which was to say without effort, without intention, in a direction it had chosen a very long time ago and saw no reason to reconsider. It carried the reflections of the stars and the lanterns with it, stretching them out downstream, carrying them toward somewhere D'Artagnan could not see from here, somewhere further on, somewhere the river knew and he did not. He breathed in. The air at the river smelled of cold water and wet stone, and something green and faintly mineral that he had never been able to name. The smell of the river itself, he supposed. The smell of moving water that has been moving for a very long time, and carries with it the memory of all the places it has been. He had smelled it in summer, warm and full, and in the sharp cold of winter, and on evenings like this one, mist softened and quiet, and it was always the same smell, one of the constants, one of the things that did not change. He stood there for a while, long enough for the mist to settle on his shoulders and the back of his cloak, long enough for two more distant figures to cross the bridge behind him, their footsteps coming and going. Long enough for the river to go on being the river, which it would do regardless. Then, gently, he pushed himself away from the wall. The last stretch home was the most familiar. These were the streets he walked every day, at every hour, in every weather. The lane with the herbalist's pots, the doorway where the old man had sat earlier in the evening and was now dark and closed and quiet. The baker's step where the yellow cat had been. The cat was gone now, called in or wandered off into some private nighttime business of its own. But the step was still warm when D'Artagnan let his hand rest on it for a moment as he passed. Still warm at this hour, still holding the sun from a day that was entirely over. He straightened and walked on. His lodgings appeared ahead, the familiar front of the building, the door with its dark iron handle, the single narrow window of his room on the upper floor, dark. He could see the whole building in the span of a glance, could have described it in his sleep. The slight list of the upper story, where the timbers had settled over the decades. The iron bracket above the door, where a lantern had once hung and no longer did. The low step worn to a smooth hollow at its center, by all the feet that had stepped on it before his. He stopped at the foot of the step and looked up at his window for a moment. Dark, quiet, waiting, in the way that rooms wait, without patience or impatience, simply empty and still, holding the dark and the quiet inside them until someone comes to fill them with warmth and breath and the small sounds of a person settling in for the night. The mist moved around him, barely there. Somewhere very far away, across the rooftops of Paris, a church bell counted a single note, one low, round sound that rolled through the cool air and faded, and faded, and was gone. D'Artagnan put his hand on the door. The door opened with its familiar groan. He had forgotten, briefly, that it would do this. The evening had been so quiet for so long that the sound was almost startling. A low wooden complaint from old hinges that had been making the same sound for so many years. It had become less a noise and more a kind of greeting. He stepped inside and pulled the door closed behind him, and the groan came again in reverse. And then there was silence. The hallway was dark. He did not need light to navigate it. He had walked this hallway enough times in the dark that his feet knew where to go without being told. How many steps to the foot of the staircase? Where the floorboard that creaked was? How much to tilt his shoulder to avoid the low beam that jutted out on the left side above the third step? His body remembered all of it. He moved through the dark with the unhurried confidence of someone at home in familiar things. The staircase rose beneath him, one step at a time. The wood spoke quietly under his weight, not the sharp creak of boards that are surprised to be stepped on, but the soft, low murmur of boards that have been stepped on many thousands of times and have made their peace with it. Each step said something slightly different. The second from the bottom said one thing. The wide step in the middle said another. The top step, which was the shallowest, barely said anything at all. And then he was at the top, and the door to his room was in front of him, and he pressed the latch and went in. The room was exactly as he had left it. This was, he thought, one of the quiet pleasures of living alone in a small room. It was always exactly as you had left it. No one had moved the chair. No one had put anything on the table that had not been there before. The wool blanket on the bed was still folded back at the corner where he had folded it that morning, and the single candle in its holder on the table was waiting in the same spot it always occupied, to the left of the small pile of papers that he kept meaning to sort through and never did. He found the tinderbox in the dark by touch and lit the candle. The flame arrived small and tentative, the way new flames always arrive, as though uncertain whether they are truly wanted. Then it steadied, and the room came into being around it. The low ceiling, the single window, the table with its papers, the chair, the bed with its plain wool blanket, the hook on the wall where his second cloak hung. It was not a large room. You could walk from one end to the other in 10 steps, and the ceiling was close enough that if D'Artagnan raised his hand above his head, his fingertips could brush the plaster. But it was his room, and it was warm, and tonight that was more than enough. He set the tinderbox down. He hung his damp cloak on the hook next to the other one and stood for a moment, letting the quiet of the room settle around him the way the warmth of the tavern had settled around him earlier in the evening. Gradually, without announcement, from all sides at once. Outside, the mist went on drifting. The streets below were silent. Even the church bells had found their rest. He carried the candle to the window. From up here, Paris was a landscape of rooftops. He had not thought about it this way at first, when he had arrived in the city. He had been too focused on what was at eye level, the people and the horses and the shop fronts, and the wide, overwhelming fact of it all. But over many months, he had come to know this view, the view from his particular window, at his particular height above the street, and it had become one of the things he returned to without quite deciding to. The rooftops ran in every direction, overlapping and varying in height, their tiles and slates dark and wet in the mist, each one a slightly different shade of dark: charcoal, blue-gray, the near black of old lead, the soft brown of terracotta that had been rained on. Above them, the chimneys rose in irregular rows, some tall and thin, some squat, some leaning very slightly as though they had been meaning to straighten themselves for years and had not yet gotten around to it. From one or two of them, faint threads of smoke still rose, pale against the dark sky, drifting not upward exactly, but sideways and upward together, dissolving into the mist before they had gone very far. And beyond the rooftops, the sky. Not a dark sky, not in Paris, not at this hour. The city made its own faint light even at night, and it rose from the streets and the windows and the lanterns, and gathered just above the rooftops in a dim, diffuse warmth the color of old bronze, that kept the sky from ever going fully dark. Within this warmth, a few stars were still visible. The same handful he had seen from the bridge, patient and unchanged, burning their careful light through the mist. D'Artagnan rested his forehead very lightly against the cool glass of the window. He looked at the rooftops. He looked at the chimneys. He looked at the pale threads of smoke drifting sideways in the dark. He looked at the faint bronze warmth above the city and the stars within it. He thought about nothing in particular, and it was very good. After a while, he set the candle back on the table and sat in the chair. The chair was old, and it had, over the years, developed an understanding of him. Or so it seemed, because it received him now with the particular ease of something that has learned the shape of a person and no longer needs to be told where to give way. He settled into it. He rested his arms along its arms. He let his head fall back slightly against its back. The candle burned on the table beside him. Its flame was steady in the closed and windless room, steadier than it had been in the tavern, where distant draughts and the warmth of many bodies had kept it in a constant, gentle motion. Here it simply burned, a single upright flame, its light falling evenly over the table and the papers and the edge of the bed and the near wall, leaving the corners of the room in a soft and friendly dark. He listened to the room. There was very little to listen to, and that was the pleasure of it. The mist outside made no sound. The street below made no sound. The building around him made only the very smallest sounds, the occasional quiet tick of a beam settling, the whisper of the wind finding some small gap somewhere in the walls and passing through it with barely a sigh. These were the sounds the building made all the time, he knew, the sounds it made whether anyone was listening or not. They were the sounds of old stone and old wood doing what old stone and old wood do, holding their shape patiently against the slow passage of time, adjusting themselves in small ways, settling and resettling, making their peace with the dark and the cold and the long, quiet hours between one day and the next. He breathed in, he breathed out. The rain returned, very softly. He heard it first as a change in the quality of the silence, a new texture in it, a faint and delicate percussion that was neither quite sound nor quite not sound, but something on the exact border between them. Then it grew a fraction, just a fraction, and became properly audible. Rain on the roof tiles above him, slow and gentle, the drops spacing themselves with the unhurried patience of rain that has all night and knows it. He listened to it fall. It fell on his roof tile and on all the other roof tiles, on all the chimneys and the slates and the old brown terracotta, on the cobblestones below and the stone sills of the windows, and the iron bracket above the door where the lantern no longer hung. It fell on the vine along the garden wall, and on the fountain with its constant trickle, and on the bridge parapet where he had rested his arms and watched the stars in the water. It fell on all of Paris, quietly, impartially, the same rain on the grand houses and the narrow lanes, and the broad gray back of the Seine moving through the middle of it all. The same rain everywhere. He closed his eyes. The candle was still burning. He could feel its warmth on the backs of his hands, a gentle, even warmth, neither too much nor too little. The rain went on above him. The building went on settling around him, its small sounds smaller now, or perhaps he was simply no longer separating them from the silence. The chair held him. The room held the chair. He thought about the miller in his boat on the still water, unable to tell the sky above from the sky below. He thought about the shepherd sitting outside his stone cottage with his gray dog beside him, watching the hills go dark row by row. He thought about the river carrying the reflections of the lanterns downstream in long, shimmering lines toward somewhere further on. He thought about the yellow cat, warm on its step. He thought about the stars. Then he stopped thinking, gently, the way the flame of a candle stops when the last of the wax is gone. Not going out exactly, but simply becoming something else, something quieter, something that does not need a name. The rain fell. The room was warm. And D'Artagnan, young man of Gascony, far from home and perfectly at home, let the last of the evening carry him, slowly and without resistance, to wherever the dark and the quiet and the soft sound of rain on the rooftops of Paris were taking him. Which was exactly where he needed to go.